Wow. Okay, so before I start, I just want to let you know that I've been attending this conference too, and I've been exactly in the position that you guys might be in right now. You know, you've got Twitter open on your laptop or your phone or something like that, and you know, you're staring at this empty input, and you've got to think of something that's both witty and engaging all at the same time, that's going to get you like tons of likes and retweets and something like that. And the anxiety that I feel when I'm faced with something like that is just sometimes too much. And so if that's something that you're facing right now, you know, maybe you could think of something like this. You could probably take that and you can just have that. That's a freebie, okay? Okay, so I'm Colin, and this is a picture of me. It's my favorite picture, actually. And I'm a software developer. I work primarily with PHP and JavaScript. For the past 4 years or so, I've been the organizer of my local PHP meetup. And on Twitter and GitHub, if you wanted to follow me, you can do so at Colin DeCarlo. I'm not going to make you do that, but overall, I think it's probably a good decision. So do that. And like Taylor was saying, I work with a really talented group of people at Vehicle in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And so Vehicle, yeah, we focus on building Laravel applications, primarily for our backend PHP framework, and we use a mix of Angular and React on the front end. Not at the same time, of course, but you know, some projects are Angular, some projects are React, those sorts of things. Okay, so got the nerves going. I've never actually been in front of a group this large before. So I figure now would probably be a good time to try and experiment. So what I'd like you to do is close your eyes. Okay, seriously, please. Close your eyes. And what I'd like you to do is think about yourself, okay? Specifically, what I want you to think about is your profession, what it is that you do, okay? And now what I'd like you to do is picture yourself without that profession. It just doesn't exist anymore. And you've got a void in your life that you need to fill. So my question is, what are you going to fill it with? If you couldn't do what you're doing right now, what would you be doing? I'll give you a couple moments to sort that out. Maybe I should be a little less refreshing at times. So you can open your eyes. Okay, so just by a show of hands, who actually participated in the little experiment? Okay, that's great, thank you. And so again, by a show of hands, how many people pictured themselves working in some sort of creative industry? Like maybe you saw yourself working in a hack lab or a machine shop or maybe even like a marketing or advertising type profession. Yeah, okay, all right. So that's pretty much my hypothesis, that as software developers, we chose this profession as an outlet for our creativity. And if we didn't have that outlet, like software development, we'd choose something else that allowed us to exercise that creative drive. And so for me, that would be furniture. I love beautiful, handmade wooden furniture. You know, but if that's not your thing, I don't discriminate. Like if you want to upholster on a bench, I'm not going to hate you for that, right? But for me, it's wooden furniture. Now, there's just something that I find a little bit hard to explain about it. There's just something deep and honest about the entire process. From starting with an image in your head to choosing the right wood to work with, and then using like a huge assortment of very specialized tools to make this furniture. And by the end of the entire process, you don't just have a piece of furniture. You've got a story to go along with it. Now, you're probably thinking that you've got a good idea of who I am, and that if you were to go into my house, you'd see all sorts of beautiful wooden furniture, and that maybe I've even got a wood shop in my backyard where all of this stuff is made. And if you thought about that, well, I'm sorry to tell you you're wrong, because this is where I buy all of my furniture. I've never built an armoire or a bench or a chair or even a coffee table. Now, I've assembled most of those things, but I've never actually built them. And you can attribute that to a lot of things, I'm sure. But I like to say that the primary reason for that is that the furniture that I'm describing, it's built in a place like this. And I just don't have one of these. In fact, I have this. That's actually my garage. And let's just say that tomorrow some Freaky Friday thing happened to me. And I woke up and I wasn't a software developer anymore. Okay? And I walk out of my house and into my backyard, there's this wood shop. And I open the doors to the wood shop and I walk into this. So, do you think that I'm going to be able to build beautiful wood furniture? No, right? Of course not. Like, I'm going to try, but I'm going to build some really janky things. Like, my coffee table, it's going to wobble. The chairs that I make, they're going to be uncomfortable. And the cabinets that I make, the doors are either not going to shut at all, or maybe they'll just be like big gaps around them, and it'll just look terrible. Okay, and so even if this right here was my reality, it's going to take me a lot of practice and a lot of mistakes to make beautiful wood furniture. Okay, so where am I going with all this? Okay, as Laravel developers, we've been given that wood shop to work with. Laravel comes with a huge assortment of really awesome tools, okay? But that doesn't mean that our first project is going to be a work of art, right? And it's not going to be a work of art for the exact same reason that my first coffee table would have wobbled. And that's because we need practice and experience with the tools before we're going to be able to use them effectively. And Eloquent is just no exception to this rule. And that's what I'm going to focus on over the next little while. And I'm going to talk about some of the experiences that I've had working through Eloquent, the practice that I've had, and the mistakes that I've made. Okay? So let's start. Model defaults. So why would having sane default attributes on your model be so important? And for me, it's a matter of eliminating an entire set of possible error conditions that my app could run into. So I like to program confidently as opposed to defensively. And that means that whenever a method in my application receives a model to work with, I presume that that model is in a valid state and ready to go. I don't want to have to ask the model if it's ready to go or if it's in a valid state. And I also don't want to have to be burdened with passing the same default values into that model's constructor every single time that I want to instantiate it. Having default model attributes allows you to declutter your code and focus on the data that matters at the time that you're building your model. And at the same time, it's going to guarantee that you get back a model that's in a valid state. Okay? So how are we going to implement default model attributes? So the first solution that I thought of was storing the default values in the database table schema. But there's a serious problem with this method. Okay, can you think of what it is? Just to yourself, don't yell it out. It's probably going to mess me up. So the problem is that the default values are actually set in the database record, but they're not actually set in the newly instantiated model. So the values that I'm allowing the database to set for me are actually set to null in the model that I had just created. And this led to some really difficult bugs for me to find. So I decided to fix it, and I fixed it with duct tape. In my app service provider, I created an observer like this, and it just hooked into the saved event that the model fires after it's been persisted to the database. And so you can see what I'm doing here is just going back to the database on every time that the model is saved and effectively refreshing it. And if you're counting, that means that every write to my database also triggered a read. Now, I'm no database expert, but I'm pretty sure that that's a solution that doesn't scale very well. So I soon considered an alternative approach. And it was similar to this. So basically what I did on every model that I wanted to have default attributes, I created a defaults property where I put those attributes. It's just an associative array where the key is the attribute that I want and the value is that default. And then what I did is each time the model is instantiated, I took the attributes that the model was being created with, and I merged them with the default attributes that I had set. And then I'd pass that off to the parent constructor, and that way that would create my model. Now, this works, okay? And it works quite well, but it's actually, I feel, a little bit like this, okay? So this chair couch thing, it works, but it doesn't feel right, you know? And I'm gonna be honest, I just don't want this in my house. So the thing that didn't sit well with me is that just to support default values, I had to create this whole extra property on the class. And moreover, the thing that really upset me was that I had to override the constructor of a core element of the framework in order to make this work. And I had to do that in every single model that I wanted to support default values. And that just couldn't be the right way to do it, and I needed to find the right way to do it. So I tackled it just like any other problem I face as a developer. I wrote down my requirements, I stared at them for a few minutes, and then I went for a walk to clear my head. And when I came back, I was sure that I had the proper solution. But the solution that I came up with was so simple that I was sure that there was something wrong with it. So if in my previous solution I was merging the attributes that were used to create the model with my default array, why shouldn't I just be able to set those attributes on the attributes array that Eloquent uses internally to store this data? Like, could it be that simple? Now, unfortunately, the docs don't say anything about it, so I was forced to use the source. All right, so I did just that. Okay, I opened up my editor, I opened up model.php, and here it is. Okay, well, just to be fair, that's not actually model.php. That's just a portion of model.php, because the last time I checked, it's 3,541 lines long. But it's pretty intimidating the first time you crack it open, and we're determined devs. So we're going to sort this out, okay? So the first requirement was that the default attributes were available as soon as the model was instantiated. And so when we access when we access attributes on our Eloquent models, we treat them as if they were public properties, okay? But of course, they're not public properties, so PHP swoops in and the magic get method gets called. So I think that's probably a good place to start. Okay, so just to set up the scenario that we're looking at here. So we've got our attributes with the default values in it that we want. So we've got published as our key, and we've set it to the value of false. And what we're asking for is published, okay? And so the first thing that Eloquent is going to want to do is take control back from PHP. So get is just going to proxy over to get attribute. So we're going to call get attribute with that key, published. And the first thing that get attribute does is it checks to see if published is a key value in attributes, and it is, so this condition is true. What we're going to do then is we're going to call this get attribute value with published, okay? So get attribute value does a little bit more work, but the first thing it does is it resolves the value of published, and it does that by calling get attribute from array. Get attribute from array does one last check to make sure that published is still a key that's in our attributes. And of course it is, because nothing's changed. So we're going to pull that value out, and it's going to be false, and we're going to return that back up the chain to get attribute value. Now, it's going to do a little bit more work. It's going to check to see if there's a get mutator for published, and there isn't. It's going to check to see if there's a cast for published, and there isn't. And it's going to see if published is one of the dates, and it's not. So we're going to skip all of those, and we're just going to return the value that we resolved originally, and that's false. So we're going to pass that back up to get attribute. And get attribute is going to return with false all the way down to get. And so we're going to be returning false from get all the way to our caller. Okay, and so that satisfies our first requirement. Okay? Now, I'm going to spare you the details of going through our second requirement, which was that the default model attributes were persisted down to the database at the time that it's saved, and just tell you that it works, okay? So you've got two options right now. You can choose to believe me, or you could use the source yourself to sort it out. And I encourage you to do that. It's a really great exercise. It gives you an opportunity to take a look at how the framework actually works and what it does. And for me, that's a really great way to increase my understanding of how I can use and also abuse this framework. Okay, so in the end, all we have to do to support default model attributes is set them in the model's attributes array. And that's a huge value that goes a long way to eliminating bugs and cleaning up our code. So I say to you, don't be afraid to use the source, and you can tweet that too if you want. All right. So quick question. By a show of hands, how many people know exactly how eloquent relations work? Okay, all right. Now, of those people that raised their hands, I got another question. How many of you know exactly how eloquent relations work? All right. So for the rest of you, don't worry, you're in good company. Taylor didn't have his hands up either for that one, okay? And the reason I asked the question is because, in my opinion, eloquent relations are what really unleash the power of the ORM. And they do so using such a simple API that it seems almost like magic, okay? So think about it. Relations either directly enable or assist in most of the things that make eloquent as good as it is, right? Eloquent models have lazy access to the related models, and that's made possible by the relation class. And if you're pulling multiple models out of your database, you can eager load those related models and avoid the dreaded n+1 query problem. Again, this is made possible by the relation class. And finally, relation classes even abstract away the details of linking related models in your database when you're creating or saving them. So, how many times have you been writing code dealing with eloquent relations and went, wow, that just works? It's a pretty great feeling, right? But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword. Because saying that just works is pretty much the same as saying, I don't know how this works. And that's where we can get into trouble, right? Because if you don't know how something works, it might as well be magic. And we've all learned that we don't mess with magic, right? So we train ourselves to write our models, our model relations, exactly as how we see them in the documentation, okay? But we're developers, right? And we don't have all day to read documentation, right? We've got clients breathing down our necks to provide features, and so we skim, right? And we find the first piece of code that looks like what we want, and we copy it, and we paste it. And don't say that you don't do this, okay? Like, we're in a safe place here. You should be able to admit this to yourselves, all right? And so we changed the relation name, and we changed the related class, and bingo bango, hey, just works, right? And it continues to just work until we get a new requirement from our client that changes how we need to load the related models, all right? And so we're back at square one. So we skim, we copy, we paste. Just works, amazing, right? But is it? So let's walk through an example of what I'm talking about and see how we can make things better. Okay, so here we are in our post model. We've set up a relation called comments, which is also the name of the database table that we're pulling the related data from. So this method defines a has-many relationship between a post model and many comment models. And our app serves a RESTful API to our front end. So here's our post comments controller. In our index action, we accept the ID of the post whose comments we want, and with the method, and the with method of the Eloquent builder makes it really easy for us to grab the comments with the post when we pull them out of the database. And so we just pass the comments back to our front end in our JSON payload like that, and it's really great, it's really easy, okay? But in comes that new requirement from our client. So some posts are very popular and they generate a lot of comments. So now what we want to do is just load the most recent comments for the post first, Okay? So we create a new controller to handle these requests, and we call it the post recent comments controller. We still want to eager load the comments though, and we remember when we were skimming the docs, we seen that you can constrain eager loads by passing the with method an associative array, right, where the key is the name of that relation, and the value is an anonymous function which accepts a query that's used to load that relation from the database. And we can add conditions to that query that constrain the result set. And again, that just works. But this is how I feel right now. You know, I've done something wrong, right? And I've created something that should never exist. And I can do better than this, right? I know in my heart of hearts, I can make that code beautiful again. So let's start. All right, so the thing that really bothers me about this, okay, is just this right here, okay? And if you think about what we're doing, we're saying, okay, eloquent, give me the comments relation. But before you pull those things from the database, what I want you to do is give me the query because I'm going to change it, okay? And then you can run that query, and then you can take whatever it gives you, and we're going to call that comments, okay? But it's not actually comments anymore, is it, right? Because we've changed it. We've changed the meaning of what that comment is. And so the key that I think we're missing is that when our client told us that what we need to do is load the recent comments, what they're actually doing is they're defining a new relationship that posts have to comments. Right? So what we're doing when we think about this is we're thinking about the relations in our database, which is just too low. What we need to start thinking about is the relations that our objects in our domain have with each other. Okay? So if our client is telling us that it could be the recent comments that they want, he's defining that new relationship. And so why don't we just do that? We just add another method to our post model called recent comments. And then we can take the body of that anonymous function and we can inline it in here. And so what we're saying is that our recent comments are many comments that where the created at value of that comment is greater than whatever carbon yesterday gives us. All right. Now, this is better, but it's not that great. I feel like I have to think too much when I'm looking at this. It's not exactly what I want. And the thing that I have to think too much about is this where clause right here. Where created at is greater than whatever carbon yesterday says. And so the good thing is that when we're chaining off our relation methods like this, we can call the scopes that exist on the classes that our relation is about. So we can actually just create a scope on comments, maybe like scope since. In scope since, we can take that where clause and we can just put it here instead. And now since can be accepted and we can just change the query that way. So we're back in our post model and we've got recent comments and it says recent comments now are many comments since whatever carbon yesterday gives us. And we're getting closer to what I really like, but I'm still thinking that I'm working too hard. And so the thing that I'm working too hard about is this carbon yesterday thing. I don't want to think about what that is. Because when my client told me that recent comments are comments that were created a day ago, since yesterday is what I want to say. So why don't I just create another scope on my comment model called scope since yesterday. And Eloquent does a really good job at making these scopes seem magical. But they're not magic, really, if you think about them. They're just methods. So I can call my scope since method in there, just passing it whatever carbon yesterday gives me. And now we're back in our post model, and our recent comments read really great. It says, recent comments are many comments that happened since yesterday. I think that looks really good. And so when we go back to our controller, all that we have to do is say, when we want to load our recent comments, we just say, give me the post with its recent comments. And there we are. Okay. So I want to stay on relations for just a few more minutes and talk about something that I think is simple yet strangely underused ability of the relation class. And that's specifically that what I'm talking about is creating models that belong to other models. So look at this example here. Okay, so we're in our post comments controller, and we're creating a comment for a post. And Eloquent makes this really easy for us. We've got the post given to us by the route model binding, and when we want to create the comment, all we have to do is call the static create method on the comment with the attributes that we want. Now, even though it's really simple to do this, we probably shouldn't be creating the comment this way. Okay, so instead, the way that we should be creating it is like this, by using the comments relation that exists on the post model. So, why do I think that this difference is so important? I mean, in the end, the result is the same, right? So, if the result is the same, aren't I just arguing over preferences? And the reason the difference is so important is because in this top example, we're circumventing the abstraction over the data layer that Eloquent is working to provide to us. Okay? And it's happening right here. So we're referring to the internal identity of the post, and that's a detail that we just shouldn't be concerned with. We're thinking past the abstraction to the underlying implementation. And so if we're doing something like this, I'm sorry, I've got bad news for you. Your abstraction is leaking. So let's start treating foreign key values more like toxic entities. We shouldn't be handling them ourselves. They're just bad for us. Instead, we need to let Eloquent manage these details for us. After all, that's what Eloquent's there for. So we're not done refactoring this controller just yet. There's another code smell that's lingering in here. Okay? So just take a look and see if you can spot it. All right. So it's right here. And I'm going to be honest with you, okay? Because I'm going to tell you a secret because it's just us, you know? When I put these slides together, I was calling this smell feature envy, okay? And then a week or so later, I was talking with my colleagues, and we decided that actually it's not feature envy, it's more inappropriate intimacy. And then after Sandy's talk yesterday, I thought, okay, maybe it's not inappropriate intimacy. I think it's more likely message chains, okay? But I think that we can all agree that this stinks, right? And we should fix it. So what's happening here is that the controller wants to create a new comment belonging to the post. And it knows that the create method exists on the comments relation. So it's going to use that to accomplish creating the comment. So the controller is reaching through posts to the comments relation so it can create the comment itself. Now, I think that we should let posts manage their own comments. And in order to do that, I think what we should do is have a new comment method on our post model. Okay? And again, that's just because since comments belong to posts, posts should have the responsibility of managing them. So we're back in our controller, and we're creating the comment just the way that we should be. All right? Everything's good in the world. I'm sorry? Your use case is different. Oh, all right, I get it. So in the real world, comments have authors too, right? And when a comment is made, we have to relate the comment to both the post and the author. So I can see how this may present itself as a problem. We're creating the comment directly with the create method on the comments relation. And it's the relation that's setting the post ID on that comment. So now both the post ID and the author ID on the comment have to be set before the comment is created. And we can't create the comment using both relations, right? So how are we going to do it? So if the requirement of our domain is that comments are associated to both posts and authors, then we're going to have to change the data that gets passed to our new comment method. And so you can see here what we've done is we've added an author parameter, and that's just going to be a user model. Now, instead of using the create method on the comments relation to both instantiate the comment and persist it to the database, we're going to have to create the new instance of the comment ourselves so we can tell it who the author is. And so once we've got the author associated with the comment, we can pass it to the save method of the comments relation, and that'll persist it. I should stop saying that word. That'll persist it down to the database for us, okay? But this method, it still has a bit of a smell too, right? And it's right here. So why don't we fix that by just adding a by author method on our comment model, and the post can use that when it's setting the author, okay? So we're back in our model for post, and our new comment looks like this. And I think that we're going through all the right channels, and now everything is a proper place. I'm trying to see if anybody pulls out their phone at this point. No? Okay. All right. So, custom collections. So, by now, I'm sure you've all heard the good news, right? And if you were at Adam's talk this morning, you might even be more stoked to get back to your project and rid your code of loops and temporary variables through the wonders of collection pipelines. And I get it, right? I really enjoy working with collections too. In fact, I even wrote my own collection library, and it's really popular. That's a legitimate statistic, by the way. Jokes aside, though, I don't think that collection pipelines, not that I don't think, I really do think that collection pipelines can improve the way that you think about the data in your application. They're a great way for a developer to isolate each action that they want to perform on a set of data and then chain those actions together to complete one operation. So if you think about it, these actions linked together to perform a single operation are a lot like a group of sentences, each presenting a complete thought brought together to form a paragraph. Okay, but have you ever opened up a controller for one reason or another just to be hit in the face with something like this? It can be a little jarring to say the least. I mean, I wrote the code to prepare for this talk. I knew that it was coming in this slide, and now, even though I'm looking at it, I want to run away from this. Okay? So what's even happening here, right? So let's take a look. So we're in our post metrics engagement controller. So we know that this trend that we're returning to our front end is going to be some metric about post engagement. Okay? We're taking the comments on the post and we're grouping them by what looks to be the difference in weeks since the post was published that each specific comment was created. Okay? And now we're taking those groups and we're just mapping them into the count of those groups. And we have to flatten that down, so instead of having a collection of collections with one count in it, we've just got a collection of counts. And then we're going to call each cons 2. Shit. Adam, is he here? Adam, what does each cons do? Okay, McGinnis. McGinnis, what does each cons do? All right, I guess I'm on my own. All right, so each cons. Each con stands for each consecutive. So we're saying take each consecutive pair of counts and create a group of those. It's kind of like a traveling window on our collection. And so we're going to map that into pairs. And then so we're going to take each pair and we're going to take the last value from the pair, and we're going to subtract it from the first value of the pair, and we're going to create a difference. So it's the difference in the number of comments from the last week to the previous week. Okay. So now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take that, and instead of it being a database eloquent collection, we're going to make it a support collection. Because now we've got a collection of counts as opposed to a collection of comments, and we don't want to have to operate on this collection as though it were a collection of comments. Okay, so we take that trend and we just send it back to our front end, and that's what it is. All right? So that's a lot to go through. You know, it's a lot to think about when you open it up. And so this is Yukihiro Matsumoto. He's the creator of the Ruby programming language. And I was listening to a podcast recently, and he was talking about how when he created Ruby, he made this statement that really stuck to me. All right, every developer is a language designer. And so what Mats was talking about is that as developers, we design the language of our application through the API of its components. Our API is a domain-specific language. So within any other context, it doesn't make any sense. But inside the context of our application, it all adds together. So if we're designing the language of our application, don't we owe it to ourselves to make sure that that language is as easy and friendly to understand as possible? Okay, so before you go tweeting that, I just want you to know that that's not actually a quote by Mats in the sense that he didn't actually say those exact words. He was telling a story about how he was at a conference and he heard Dave Thomas say something remarkably like that. So it's more like a quote by me. channeling Dave Thomas by way of Yukihiro Matsumoto. Okay. So keeping that in mind, though, don't you think a better language for our application would be this? Where we have the post and we say to the comments, give me your week-over-week engagement. Or better yet, don't you think a post should just know what its week-over-week engagement is? Okay, so that's possible, so let's start refactoring. The first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to override the new collection method on our comment model. So when you get a collection of models back from the database, internally we call the new collection model the new collection method on the model, and it gives us back an eloquent database collection. So we need to jump in here, and we have to say that when we're getting a collection of comments back, give us instead a comments collection. And this is our comments collection. It just extends the database eloquent collection. And here's our week-over-week engagement method. And you can see all I've done is taken that collection pipeline from the controller and just inlined it here. The only thing that I'm doing different is I'm eager loading the post so that every comment has it when we calculate the difference in weeks. Okay? Now, this is pretty good, but when I'm looking at it, I have to think too much again. Well, I have to think a lot anyways because it's kind of dense, but this group by is something that bothers me. So the group by, generally when I'm grouping a collection by things, I want to group by an attribute of those models. But our comments model doesn't actually have an attribute called diff in weeks or weeks since post. But we can add one, right? All we have to do is add a get mutator on our comments model called get week since post attribute. And then we can just take the body of that anonymous function and we can put it in here. And so now when we go back to our comments collection, we can just say group by week since post. So that's a lot easier for me to read. Now, if you remember, this method exists on our comments collection, but we wanted to say to our post, hey post, give me your week-over-week engagement. So what we have to do is we have to add a method to our post model that just calls week-over-week engagement on its comments. Okay, and so we're back to our controller now, and it reads like this. And this is easier for me to read and understand. All right. So we're just about there. Just hold on. All right. So this is a jig. Getting back to the furniture. This specific jig is a very fancy version of a type of jig called a box miter jig. They're used to hold frames that have been mitered together at a 45-degree angle to the table saw blade. And so the jig and the frame are both passed over the table saw blade, and it makes a slice through the miter joint. And so miter joints are actually pretty weak, just by nature, by the way they're put together. And so when you cut a slice through them there, it gives you an opportunity to glue what's called a miter joint spline in there, and that will reinforce the joint. Okay, and so they actually look pretty decorative. This is them here. So that's a miter joint spline, that's a miter joint spline, that's one. So it makes it look really nice, in my opinion, too. And so jigs like this are used to guarantee that the same cut gets made time and time again. Okay? They're very useful, very customized tools. And I have a jig that I like to use for generating reports in my applications that I'm going to share as a final part of this talk. So honestly, Eloquent, the ORM, it doesn't fit well with generating reports. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not the right tool for the job. An ORM's focus is more on the models of your application, right? So it's focusing on your blogs and your posts and your comments, things like that. But a report puts its focus more on the metadata than the data itself. So for instance, we're talking about the number of posts or the number of comments, all the way to like the number of comments from posts from a specific blog get if they're published before noon on a Monday versus after noon on a Monday. So reports are probably where I've seen the hairiest code of any application, but they generally don't start out that way, right? So they grow into it. So let's see an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so our client comes to us and they say, we'd like to have a page that we can go to in the app and we can see where all the authors are writing posts. Okay, and I want to see how many posts were written by each author and how many comments they've gotten to date. So you think about that and you're like, okay, Eloquent's not going to work for this. Let's just use the the DB query builder, right? So not too bad. So here we are, and we're in our posts by author controller. And we're using the query builder to generate this report by joining our users, our posts, and our comments database tables to get the results that our client is asking for. The query is pretty straightforward, actually. And we just take the results of that query and we pass it back to the browser as our report, okay? And your client is really happy with this. In fact, they're so happy that they're learning more about their application that they want to drill down into the data to get a closer look at it, right? So now they want the ability to optionally limit the report to only active authors, okay? So an active author is just an author that, or a user that is logged in the application within the last 3 months. And you know, we've actually just found a bug in the original report, and it seems that it's been including draft posts, right? And draft posts don't get comments, so it's kind of throwing the numbers off. So the report should just exclude draft posts by default, but you know, that's only maybe if we want to. Like if we want to include draft posts, just put an option there, like a flag or something, sort it out so that we can toggle that back and forth, okay? All right, so it's getting a little tight in here, right? But I had to shrink the font down, but we've got our options in there. Here they are. So here's us filtering only active users, and here we are including draft posts if they ask for them, okay? So the client is really happy with these changes, right? But they've just started tracking backlinks to posts too. So it would be really helpful if they could limit the report to only posts that were published after a certain date. And it would be really neat to see how posts with backlinks stack up against posts that don't have backlinks. So there should be an option to filter the results by whether or not a post has backlinks. But backlinks should probably just be ignored if we haven't said to include them or exclude them, okay? So your client is thrilled, right? But how do you feel? Probably similar to how people feel when they realize that they've got this in their house, right? You're terrified. You don't know how this got here, right? You sort of remember talking to someone about a couch, but you don't really remember it being described like this. And let's just be honest, you're afraid to touch it, right? It's got so many sharp points on it that it's probably just better and safer if we leave it where it is, right? So when a client asks me to generate a report, how do I keep this out of my code? So the thing that I do is I reach for my report jig. And so my jig is just a simple abstract class called report. The constructor accepts the active database manager, which is the same object that the DB facade resolves to. And so this way I can start my query at any table in the database that I want to. The constructor just assigns that database manager to the DB property and then calls the abstract protected method build base query and assigns that to the query property. Now, the only other method that you see in here is get, and all that does is execute the query and return the results, the caller. So here's the post by author report using that jig when it was just the authors, the number of posts that they've written, and the number of comments that they've gotten. Okay, so it all happens in the build base query method because that's the base of our report, right? That's the thing that everything else is built on. So here it is in our controller. So it's pretty simple, and it's moved all of the know-how of how to build the report out of the controller and back into our domain. And so when the client comes back to us requesting modifications or improvements to the report, all we have to do is add methods to our report that modify that query. So let's say, for instance, they ask to filter by active users. Or if they're including draft posts or not. So anything. Your controller stays simple and just proxies the options back to the report, which does all the work. So you see here what we've got in our controller is we're filtering by the active users, whether or not we're including drafts, if we have to deal with backlinks or all, and that cutoff date for when the posts were posted. So it's all rolled up into one happy report, and I think that's pretty neat. All right. So if my presentation was a story, and there was a moral to the story, I would have to say that what the moral is that when you write your code for your application, it's going to work, right? And that's great. But, sorry. And that's great, right? But after you write the code and it works, just take a step back from it and look at it, right? And see how it feels, right? And if it doesn't feel quite right, just try to make an experiment to see if you can make it any better, right? And if you do make it better, that's great, right? You've made your code better, it's easier to read, it's more semantic, wonderful. And if you didn't make it any better, you've really not lost anything. Just revert the change, right? And you've gained experience, and you've gained practice working with your tools. And so you're going to know for next time whether or not something is going to work or not, right? So just get out there, just make mistakes, and get as much practice as you can, all right? So I just hit 45 minutes, so I actually don't have time for questions. I'm sorry. But we're just going into a break, so if you do have a question, you can just find me out in the lobby. I'm going to be drinking water, and we can talk about it, okay? All right, thanks.